So what's going on, everybody? I know you guys have probably heard these remarks in the past that theists don't understand science. That is, unless you're a theistic evolutionist, or that, more specifically, if you're a creationist, you don't understand the peer-reviewed process or scientific process or models. Now, I decided to make a quick video to respond to this because I think that this is probably one of the most ironic statements that I've heard from evolutionists, especially here online. And one of the reasons why is because a lot of evolutionists that tend to try to defend evolution or talk about science, they typically approach evolutionary theory as if it is not falsifiable, unfalsifiable. And they seem to think in their mind that a peer-reviewed article, if presented, is somehow some sort of absolute fact or confirmed data, or that a scientific model is the only way or line of truth or reasoning regarding science. This is just the approach that is. And they don't seem to understand that when you're dealing with a published article or a scientific model, that this does not mean fact, not even necessarily truth. It is a case made based on a certain set of data that is available now. That's one of the reasons why we have falsifiability. It opens the door for investigation over certain topics or claims or views inside of science. The reality of the situation is that scientific models have more often been incorrect than they've been correct. There have been more scientific models that have been completely overturned and completely refuted and shown to be incorrect based on new and continuous changing of data or information that continues to progress in the scientific realm. Well, now somebody's to say, well, of course, that's what the peer review process is for. Well, that's true. But if you look on my channel, you'll see a couple of different videos that I've actually uploaded in which, in those videos, I show several different news sources and articles like the New York Times or different articles from Britain, where they've done an investigation and had shown that through the peer review process, there has been altered images, misinformation, downright fabrication of data that has continued and continued and continued in the scientific realm. And this is after they've gone through the peer review process. In some cases, they've actually, the misinformation inside of the peer review process has actually carried on for years and sometimes decades. And as the New York Times explains, this problem has increased tenfold and is continuing. So the peer review process has its use, but in reality, if we look at the peer review process and we look at the history of science, the problem still occurs. So the reality of the situation is that the best way to approach a situation in science to see what makes sense may or may not be dependent on the peer-reviewed process or a scientific model. We got to keep in mind that induction is just one form of reasoning. I know that induction is pretty much the dominant view of reasoning within inside of science, but we also have to understand that deduction and abduction are also very much so legitimate. And many forms of, or should I say approaches towards truth has been applied throughout the course of science, going back now to hundreds of years, all the way back to the birth or the foundation of all modern science, which would be alchemy. I mean, their approach was completely different than it is now, and the way that they were, the alchemists were trying to learn more about the world was through the hope of it and investigating the supernatural things like angels, or in some cases it had to do with an elixir of sorts. So the point being is this, is that scientific models, the peer review process, is not the only avenue of truth. And more often than not, scientific models have been overturned. They've been incorrect more than they've been actually correct. This doesn't mean that they are in some way illegitimate or not necessary in some way, but you have to be wise the way that you approach a scientific model, and you have to be wise the way that you approach a published article, because they do not mean fact, they do not mean truth.